ancient origins and human identity, changing the way that we think of our history and ourselves. As I grow as a healing facilitator, as a husband, as a father, as a person who just desires to understand more and be able to hold more responsibility on my shoulders, there seems to be a relationship between my own personal awareness and also my awareness of who I am, where we come from. And there seems to just be an expansion, inside and outside. And so as I grow, I learn more, and really this is me sharing that with you and hopefully to enhance your journey as well. So I love this quote: "We do not see things as they are, we see them as we are." And as human beings, I think that one of the components for any kind of growth is that we have to have a healthy nervous system so that we can just process information, and put things together correctly and have appropriate action to those things. And we got to be able to see clearly and think clearly. And if we're in defense and we're frustrated and we're freaked out, and we're going to see things through a lens of defense and frustration and freaked out. And when we're in the optimum state of growth and safety, that seems to be when we enjoy learning and we get the most out of ourselves. So I remember when I was a little kid, I got in this argument in 3rd grade with this little girl named Janine. So I believe that, for sure, cavemen were the first people. And this girl Janine's like, no, Adam and Eve were the first people. And I'm like, caveman. And she's like, Adam and Eve. So we got in this big old fight. But as I grew older, I started to dive more into scriptures. And I definitely became more of a devout believer in what the Bible was telling me. However, I would always hit my head on these debates with people well, Earth's 6,000 years old. No, it's 4.5 billion years old. And it's well, what's the proof? Here, I show you the fossil record over here, and we can look at the layers in the sediment that each of those be in a year, but please show me where 6,000 years are. And so there's all these I was well, I guess I just have to believe in faith. It's just faith, and you're wrong, and God's right, and you're just part of the devil's plan, and I'm just gonna but that doesn't work. You know what I mean? It's so I had a conundrum, a big time conundrum with scriptures. One was, is the Earth 6,000 or was it 4.5 billion years old? That's a big debate, with religious people and mainstream people. Are we a product of random chance? Is the universe just rolling a dice and maybe I'll get a tree, maybe I'll get a nebula? Or are we a product of an organizing intelligence? Those are really interesting things. And as I dive into learning about physics, and there definitely seems to be levels of organization that don't appear to be random at all. And this is another one. Is humanity the most advanced it's ever been? Are we all that's been there? Is this the best that we are? It seems in a lot of ways hey, this is the best we have. However, when we look at old structures around the whole planet, it seems like we go back far and these structures get more and more perfect. You look at the Great Pyramids, of Giza. Look at some of these pyramids in Mexico and some of these mountains in the United States that are they're astronomically aligned with certain constellations. Apparently the ancients knew things that we just don't really know now, or that we don't build with now. They built with bigger blocks and they move things way farther and they're more precise. And the story it doesn't make sense, So these are those questions. Are we the most you've ever been, or have we been somewhere before? So I tell people what we believe is more influential in our life than what's actually true. That's such a true thing. If you believe you're worthless, it doesn't matter how many wonderful things they tell you about you that prove that you're not. It's really our perception. It goes back into the quote that I started with. And when we get stuck in having to be a believer in something, and when I say a believer, I'm not just saying a fundamental Christian. You can be a fundamental atheist. You can be a fundamental science person who's just completely against anything that has to do with intuition and in emotion, because it's not measurable, so it's not real. So cognitive dissonance is really just believing in comforting lies over in inconvenient truth. And we run into those things. I think right now collectively, with the media is a perfect example, because it's divided. You go to Fox, you go to CNN, you'll see the opposite things, and it's like, and we'll pick and choose what we want, and we'll discard what we don't want, versus it's clearly part of a whole. So what's the mainstream narrative so far on how we got here as human beings? Well, mainly there were these primitive apes 55 million years ago, and they evolved into some of our ancestors. And when there's like Homo erectus and others, and then 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, just like me and you, just kind of popped up. And up until 1955, there was this missing link that was in the London Museum, but they found out that it was a fake. I don't remember what his name was, who found this, but it was a human skull with a chimpanzee jawbone stuck on there, and it was claimed to be found as the missing link, and it was dismissed. The issue with the missing link is that up to this point, we haven't found anything that resembles a missing link. We haven't found the missing piece that we evolved from apes. Now, does that necessarily mean that we did or didn't? Nah, I'm not saying that. But clearly, people just like you and me, right now, we're walking around 200,000 years ago, and there's no record of the evolution path that got us here. We kind of poofed out of nowhere, at least on the fossil record. And it's really interesting, and this is baffling people. And I think it's important, and I think that this is really the purpose of what this talk is. Maybe we can shed some light or have a little more of a cleaner dialogue on how we got here. So we seem to have this debate. Is it religion or science? Do you believe in stuff that's make believe and not really real, or do you believe in like what's actually concrete? And my argument is really, I don't think that it's opposite sides of something. I think that we're taught that we get lured and we get to choose this or this, and I think that they both can complement one another. And that's I think science and religion, I think they're saying some of the same things. It's just a different way of interpreting what we're looking at. So this is the modern history timeline. So modern human timeline, of Homo sapiens. So say this is 200,000 years, okay? Well, so yeah, 200,000 years. So it's a long time compared to my lifetime, but it's not that long compared to how long the Earth has supposedly been here. Now, right here, this is present day. So this is where we are in this whole 200,000 year timeline, which means that 95% of our history on this planet, we don't have any account for what that says. It's considered prehistoric or mythology, pretty much. And so do we have any way of having any idea of what happened these last 200,000 years if we don't have any record from times before the Neolithic age started, which is the age after the Ice Age? Well, the question is, what are our first written record examples? And well, that goes into ancient Sumer, the Sumerians. And the Sumerians, this was the very first civilization that we know of that really grew out of the hunter-gatherer culture from the Neolithic, which is the end of the last Ice Age. Hunter-gathering, you start to see around 8,000 BC, and after that, little pods of agriculture showing up in the Levant, around Syria and Turkey, and then all of a sudden, poof, we have this full-blown civilization in Sumer. So 4,500 to 1900 BC is when this is kind of this has been going on, when this civilization started to bloom. And so they were located in the Fertile Crescent. So this is Mesopotamia. So to give you an idea, this is like Iraq, right here where Baghdad would be. Egypt is over here, that's the Nile River. This would be Israel, and there's the Sinai, and there's like Lebanon, and this is Turkey up here. And so this is the Tigris and Euphrates River. And as a matter of fact, this land, that's where Abram then was born. So he was a Sumerian. And so a lot of times we think there's a separate thing, like there was some time before. It's like, actually no, like when you go back to the beginning of what the Bible is saying, this is the time and place, whether you're talking about the Tower of Babel and Nimrod, or you're talking about Abram in the land of Ur. So this is the area where this was all going on. Okay. There's all these cuneiform tablets that have been found. There's thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, or maybe more, but for sure hundreds of thousands of these tablets. And what's interesting about the Sumerians is they had the first form of written language, which is called cuneiform. And so it was all symbol language. And for a long time, there was only a few people that could actually translate this stuff. But now, as people are studying more and more information, there's more people that are able to translate what these texts were saying. And what's interesting is, as we start to translate these Sumerian stories, we start to see glimpses of stories that are very familiar to us that came later, including the Bible and the Quran, Judaism. So the Sumerian Genesis, according to this was written 1,200 years before the Bible, minimum. So this is really important to understand this, that these stories were already on the planet before the Bible was even written. And they tell an interesting story, and they have an interesting time period. So the main story that these tablets talk about is that there was this group called these Anunnaki. And so Anunna means from heaven, those from heaven, and Ki means earth. So those from heaven who came to earth. So these beings came to earth around 400,000 to 450,000 years ago, according to their timeline. And some say they're brought here to terraform the earth, to mine for minerals, so they could use it for their planet. There's other scholars, like a guy named Anton Parks, a Frenchman, he's awesome. He says that his translation is that there was a war, some type of war in the cosmos, and they landed here for some type of refuge. But it's an interesting story. And when they came here, there was a upper echelon of these Anunnaki, and there was a lower echelon, lower level. And they were called the Agigi, the lower level. And there were these Agigi gods, and they were the ones that did all the main labor, apparently. And they were working in the mines for 200,000 years, according to what these texts say. And after 200,000 years, they started to grumble. The work was way too difficult. And there was a mutiny. And there were two main Anunnaki characters. They're both males. One was called Enki, and En means Lord, Ki means earth, so Lord of the earth. And this other guy, his brother, Enlil, Lord of the air. And Enki was more of the, he was a geneticist. He was more empathetic towards people, whether it's the Yigi or others. Enlil was more of the sociopathic warmonger between the two. Hey, just get it done, the CEO. And there was a big mutiny, and there was an uprising. And this Enki says, hey, how about I take some of these lower hominids that are on this planet and mix them with our blood, with our genetics, and we'll create a slave species. So they came together in a council, and the Adam was created to work for the gods around 200,000 BC, according to these tablets. And so Adam, that was the name. The Adam is a Sumerian name, and that means from the red earth. It means from the red earth. So later on, so as the Adam is created, and it wasn't just a single, it was an actual race of people, of us, apparently. And they ended up getting enlightened. And according to these tablets, there's two theories about what Enki actually gave to them. And Enki is the one who what we call the serpent. And one was he showed them how to use the tool for building things and for hurting people. So he taught them how to use the tool. And another thing is that he taught them how to reproduce, because apparently these first Adams or Lulus were sterile like mules, and they were easily controllable. And then Enki, being the geneticist, he hybridized some of them and made them able to reproduce. And that may have been what that unforgivable sin was in the garden. So, and by the way, this is in Eden, the land between the terrace. It was called Eden. And so man starts growing, and Enlil gets all pissed off, and because he's like, oh, I can't stand these humans, and they're all they do is make, and so Enlil decides that he's gonna, there's a flood coming, some kind of cataclysm, and he makes all the gods swear, because he's like the #1 guy, that you won't tell any humans. And so they make an oath, and Enki, actually, he knows he's not supposed to tell any humans, but he decides, I'm just gonna talk to a wall really loud, and this guy Ziusudra will hear me. And while he was talking to the wall, he told the wall that he needed to build an ark because a flood was coming. And Ziusudra was the Sumerian name for Noah. So super interesting, that little background of the story. But I want to just dive into the creation of the Adam. And this is super cool because I think you're going to find some parallels. So this is the Nippur tablet. And so we talked about, they made a choice that they're going to create a slave race. And this is part of that conversation. So it says, when the gods, this is the Agigi, this is when, like before they created, when there's like an uprising. So when the gods, like men, bore the work and suffered the toil of the gods was great, and the work was heavy, the distress was much. Then over here it says, and then so now they decided they're going to make this slave race. So in the clay, God and man shall be bound, to a unity brought together, so that to the end of the days, the flesh and the soul, which in a God have ripened, that soul in a blood kinship shall be bound. And I chose this because here you see, we think, okay, it's just like using clay, but when you start to look at these translations of clay, this just means of the earth. This could literally mean like something that's of the earth and of God, and they actually bound them together. And what's interesting too is that they talk about flesh and soul. There's something unique about the incarnation of a soul. It sets apart an animal from and something else, something a little more divine, and we're going to talk about that as we get into Genesis. But so you can clearly see there's some type of mixing of them together, and if we're going to be honest, if we're going to create a human being, it's going to be pretty advanced. Like we're thinking of potentially some advanced technology that are happening. These weren't just people putting blood in a bucket, and maybe we're going to get a baby out here if we shake it up enough. So Adam means made of the dark red earth. So from the Sumerian tablets, now I want to go just to what Genesis is saying, and I'm using these translations from the original King James, because if I just want to, most Christians aren't going to argue with me about what the King James says. And so what does Genesis say about in the beginning? And this is where I think things get interesting. So Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Genesis 2, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So when I first read this, I was just, okay, in the beginning, God creates heaven and the earth, and it was just like, and there was before light was created, and it's just primitive, right? There's just nothing going on. But I started just kind of, okay, what do these words actually say? This is not what the original Hebrew said. This is a translation. So I looked at the Strong's, and when I looked at what it said for God, the word God is Elohim. Elohim. It means gods in the ordinary sense, but specifically used in the plural, thus usually with the article of a supreme god, occasionally applied by the way of difference to magistrates. So the term Elohim is a plural term, and it's usually used to identify different groups of beings in a hierarchy. And I was just like, what? And so I'm looking back into King James, I'm like, okay, so in the beginning, the Elohim, the powerful ones, the shining ones, the gods, created the heaven and the earth. Okay, well, I didn't cover it in this talk, but the Sumerians talk about gods, like a primordial gods creating these things. And in the future, I'm going to talk more about what the Greeks are saying and what the Veda texts are saying. But there seems to be something parallel here. Now, Genesis 2, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So wow, just what a mystical like picture, right? Well, I was just going through and it's like, okay, and the earth was. Well, what do you mean was without form? So does that just mean the earth at that time was just formless because that's what it was? Well, the word is heya or hawya, excuse me, and that means to become or became. It means that and so I was reading for it, I was like, so what it means the earth became. It means it wasn't like that at first, it became that way. So the earth became without form and void. And so what void means is bohu. And it's indistinguishable, it means a ruin or a wasteland. And I was just like, oh, okay, this is interesting. So now it's like we have an earth that became it became that way, it became a wasteland. And darkness was upon the face of the earth, or the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. I was always confused about that passage because I'm like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth, but why would he make it like, it just looks like it's not complete, you know? But then as I start to read these translations, you start to get a much different picture. First of all, you have beings, instead of just one omnipresent being that is from a long ways away that just makes things appear out of nowhere. You have these specific beings, and then you have the sense of an earth that has been potentially decimated by something. So now it's like, the question is there a main beginning in Genesis 1, and then something happens, and is this a reboot of the earth? Or is this just the beginning of everything, just right from the beginning? And the question is, if this is a reboot, how much time was in that little space that's missing? And it opens up to the possibility of this saying what other things are saying, just in a much sneakier way. So the biblical Genesis, and God, and so now when I say God, and the Elohim, and the God, let's say the shining ones, that's the actual pronunciation, and the shining one said, let us make man in our image and in our likeness, and let them have domain over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. This just tripped me out, because I'm always like, what's the plurality? Because before it was like, I heard you have God, but then it said us, like, okay, weirded me out. Now it's making a little more sense to me. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created them. So you have this creation of man being created. They're both male and female. And then it says, and God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. Replenish. Why wouldn't you just fill the earth? When you replenish something, you fill something up that was once full. And so as I look back in Genesis 1 and I read this, I'm thinking more and more that, wow, this sounds like this may be a restart of something. This may be a clear restart from some type of cataclysm, or and clearly they're talking about the whole earth, and there's male and female, and it's like, whoa, okay, this is interesting. So then you go to Genesis 2, 7 and 15. So when he says and, he didn't say, it's not saying, he's saying he did this in one, and this is in addition to what's happening in one. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Very interesting, because now another name for dust is clay. And here we are, we're seeing that there was man already, but when he breathed breath, man became a living soul. So I'm seeing a parallel between what the Sumerians were saying about a soul making something different than just being a man. And the Lord planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. This is a much different picture than being fruitful and multiplying and just filling up the earth and having babies with. You can clearly see that there's a garden planted, and wow, gosh, I should have looked up the name for like the actual translation for garden, but it was it's not like a botanical garden. It was more of like a working place, but I'll have to get to that at a different time. And the Lord God took the man, and he put him in the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. Well, this is interesting, because you think, oh, just a nice little naked guy just pruning flowers. Well, as I looked up what dress was, it's the word abad, and it's a causative. It's made in when to dress. It's in the sense of to enslave, to be kept in bondage. It's not like it's what someone who's a slave or is kept in bondage would do. It's that type of labor. It's not meant in like, oh, look at the butterfly. It's a different kind of picture than I first saw. So here we are, in Genesis, and there seems to be a much different picture of this Adam put in the Eden than we had in the original, than I've had in what I originally understood to be what the Bible is saying. So now we talked about what the Sumerians said in mythology. We've talked about what Genesis said in the King James Version. And there's a possibility of more time in the Genesis passage existing than what we may have thought. There may be a larger gap of time than we thought, a little more than 6,000 years, if there's a potential reboot. We have seen some parallels between what the Sumerians are saying about how they created with the clay of the earth and mixing with their, and how a soul was incarnated, and with also what Genesis is saying, and the potential that Eden may have not been a nice, relaxing place for Adam. There's a connection there. But now I want to just kind of go into what is modern science saying about the origin of Homo sapiens sapiens, and does modern science and any of what I've just said have any parallels? Let's go check it out. So there's a genetic mystery. Nature has a really special way of making sure that certain errors aren't passed on, like really bad errors. And the way nature does it is that when there's an error passed on, the person dies at really young, or dies before they can reproduce, so they can't pass the information on. That's one of the things evolution does for us. Well, researchers have discovered that that the molecular basis of 4,000 disorders and 1,000 genetic variations that make a small contribution to common complex diseases and point towards potential therapeutic targets. This is the Human Genome Research Institute. What I wanted to point out is that they've discovered that our genome has 4,000 errors in it. Chimpanzees have like 40 to 60 errors. So we have a tremendous amount of errors, and 12 of those errors alone will kill you before you reach puberty, like kill you. And the thing is, it's not like a bunch of Hawaiians only have these 12, or a bunch of Armenians, or like this little sect down in like Brazil has these errors. The whole you and me, we all have these base errors. And so the question, so it's like, that's really weird that we have all these errors passed on, and it doesn't seem to be something that happened naturally in a sense, right? Like, if we evolved naturally, how would all these errors pass on? If that makes any sense. So now I want to just tie into human chromosome number 2 specifically, because this is something that it's baffling people. It's definitely a problem in science. And if you're familiar with chromosomes, they basically are the housing of genes. And at the end of these chromosomes, there's these little like imagine like a shoestring, the hard part of the shoestring. It's called a telomere, and they pretty much hold the gene together. And so when we have to reproduce a cell or make a new cell, we'll cut out pieces of the telomere instead of the actual cell. But once the telomeres disappear, that's what's considered aging. And when the telomeres disappear, the whole gene starts to unravel. So just kind of, that's what a chromosome looks like here. So chromosome number 2, it contains 8% of our DNA. It's a large amount of DNA in this chromosome. This is the gene responsible for the development of the frontal cortex. So this is the one gene that separates the Homo sapien from an orangutan. We have like 99% of the same DNA as an orangutan, but this is the thing that separates us and makes us different. The reason why humans have humans have 46 chromosomes and our apes have 48. And what's weird about it is, it's not the fact that we have 2 less chromosomes, it's the fact that this chromosome is made up of 2 ape chromosomes that have been fused together into one. Yeah. And our chromosomes naturally will fuse together if there's an error, if there's something that breaks off, and one will just kind of connect to another one. However, when I talk about these telomeres, these little shoelaces, never in nature do they fuse telomere to telomere. Does not happen. This chromosome number 2 is fused telomere to telomere, which is very strange. It's a very strange thing that we're seeing. So human chromosome number 2 is a result of an end-to-end fusion of 2 ancestral chromosomes, these primates, whatever these primates were. The evidence for this includes the correspondence of chromosome 2 to 2 ape chromosomes. The closest human relative, the chimpanzee, has nearly identical DNA sequences to the human chromosome 2, except they're found in 2 separate chromosomes. So what we're noticing is that our second chromosome, which gives us this cortex, it's got some funny stuff going on behind it. And I want to share this video with you. This is a short little video. A guy named Greg Braden. He's a geologist, and he's an incredible guy, scientist. But this is really diving into what they're finding about the human genome and what separates us from the rest of the flock of life, and just kind of we'll go from there.
What has been thought to be missing DNA in the past isn't really missing at all. It's been with us all along, only it's been modified and rearranged in a way that wasn't obvious in the past.
This is
the second largest chromosome in the human body, forming 8% of the total DNA in our cells, human chromosome number 2, actually contains the smaller missing chromosomes found in the chimp genome. In other words, at some point in the past, for reasons that remain controversial, 2 separate chimp chromosomes were combined into a single larger chromosome that now is our chromosome number 2. While scientists acknowledge that the mutations definitely occurred in FOXP2 and that they happened within the time frame that correlates with the rise of the anatomically modern humans,
200,000 years
they
ago.
can't really tell us what caused that change to happen. New technology has revealed precisely what happened to create human chromosome number 2. So I'll share the discovery in two ways with you. First, in the scientist's own technical language, from the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, to reveal the details of the discovery itself. And then I'll describe it again with a simpler description in lay language to illustrate why this discovery is so important to what it means in our discussion. And this is a quote from the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. We conclude that the locus cloned in cosmids C8.1 and C29b is the relic of an ancient telomere-to-telomere fusion and marks the point at which two ancestral 8 chromosomes fused to give rise to chromosome number 2. I know that's a technical description, and I wanted you to hear it in the researcher's own words. The simplified explanation: it appears that long ago, 2 separate chromosomes from chimpanzees, and these were chromosomes 2A and 2B, were merged or fused into the single larger chromosome that is now our human chromosome 2. It's the key that gives us our humanness. Many of the characteristics that make us uniquely human come from this fusion. I want to be absolutely clear that what I say next is not the conclusion of peer-reviewed science. Although I've spoken with mainstream scientists who have told me that they suspect what I'll share is true, yet they are reluctant to speak publicly about their suspicions in fear of losing their reputation, their credibility, or even their jobs. When I honestly consider the evidence that I've shared, it simply makes sense to look beyond evolution and an unbelievably good run of biological luck to explain the fact that we exist as we do. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests that, number 1, we are the result of an intentional act of some kind. Point: the mutations in FOXP2 and human chromosome 2 are precise. Point: the mutations in FOXP2 and human chromosome 2 appear to have happened quickly. Point: the optimization of human chromosome 2 that occurred after the fusion happened appears to be intentional. Point: the fact that after 150 years of searching, no physical evidence has been discovered that links us to other forms of life on the tree of primate evolution suggests that we may be a species unto ourselves with no evolutionary history. Number 2, we are the product of an intelligent form of life. Point: the timing, the precision, the accuracy of our genetic mutations, and the technology required to yield such mutations implies forethought and intention of an advanced intelligence. Point: the intelligence that carried out genetic modifications, giving us our humanness, had the advanced technology to do so 200,000 years ago in a way that we are only learning to do today. For example, DNA fusion and gene splicing.
FOXP2 is the gene responsible for giving us the ability to speak. And FOXP2, like chromosome number 2, this mutation happened around 200,000 years ago. This is one of those things, and they happened quick. Didn't happen primitive, they happened quick. It's right at the birth of the time of language and different types of communication. And so clearly you can see my interest in, as I look into what these stories are telling and what science is telling, and this conundrum of human beings like not really understanding who we are, and also not to mention that, you know, we're a weird species. We're birthed, and then it takes 18 years for us to like basically be able to let off so we can maybe survive. We go hiking and we love to be out in nature, but we gotta have shoes on and stuff, right? Because You know, we don't have any hair on our body. We walk upright and we're slow. You know, so we're not fit for like survival in the wild per se. We're an interesting species, absolutely, and we seem to be the only species on the planet that has all the ability to clone chickens, but we don't really know what we are. Like, what is going on, right? But it's an interesting thing. So my conclusion to this is I see a connected past, connected through the information that I presented to you. I see a connection of things that the mainstream will say they're not able to be reconciled amongst one another. So the one thing is the Sumerian creation story is a potent influence behind many of the world mythologies and religious belief systems. So in the future, in future presentations as I go, this is part one, I'm going to go into part two, and I'm going to talk about a cataclysm, the potential cataclysms and the geology behind that, and also the mythology that supports the geology as well, these cataclysms, and how this may very well have been a reboot in Genesis 1 instead of the beginning. The Greeks, as you look at these, if you look at like Poseidon and Zeus, you read these stories, you go, oh my gosh, it sounds a lot like Enki and Enlil, or what the Babylonians were saying, and then you start to look into Judeo-Christian and the Tower of Babel is like, whoa, you start to see these parallels behind these belief systems. Second is fantastic stories of old are now being supported through the advances in modern technology, such as genetic splicing and modification. Not to mention, in the Bhagavad Gita, there's all of these stories of high-level advanced warfare. And there's a place called Mohenjo-daro in Pakistan. To this day, it's radioactive. Like, it's highly radioactive. It's dangerous to be around these ruins, and they're 5,000 years old. There are sheets of glass in the Sinai Desert, like throughout all of Arabia, and the sheets of glass is only for, you had to heat up the air 2,000 and above, and what kind of heat is going to create that kind of nuclear explosion would do that. But there's all these stories of old and these fantastic explosions that don't make any sense until now. We're seeing radioactive isotopes. I don't want to get too crazy, but we found radioactive isotopes that are only produced from nuclear detonations, even on planets, and it's kind of crazy. It's just like, oh gosh, So technology is catching up with some of what these stories were saying in our past. Religion, science, and mythology appear to be pointing in a common direction regarding the previously unexplainable origins of Homo sapiens sapiens. So, when we looked at what the fossil record's saying, what modern geneticists are saying about what our genes look like have happened, what the stories are saying as well, it seems maybe they're pointing in the same direction. And it may be that the only thing that separates history from mythology is just time. So now, after this presentation, I hope that we can look a little differently and say, hey, the argument is not between evolution and creation. It's logic and reason versus superstition and ignorance.